Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have a little bit of quiet for Milan Rai, everybody, put your hands together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's become very quiet now. I've been asked to come along and say a few words about the war dead in Iraq. We've just been remembering in a very public way the British soldiers who've died in war, and there's been particular attention to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which now claimed as many lives from British Armed Forces as the 1982 Falklands War. The last year was the most bloody year for the British Armed Forces since 1982. More British Armed Forces personnel died in that year than in any previous year since 1982. And 1/3 of those deaths were avoidable, according to an analysis of military inquests and official documents. What I've been asked to come along and speak about today is about the people on the other end, the people in Iraq, and what we know about how many of those people have died as a result of the decision to invade Iraq. As you'll know, there's a lot of dispute about exactly how many people have died in Iraq as a result of the invasion and occupation. And the government doesn't like to talk about it, but when they do talk about it, they like to talk in terms of tens of thousands of people. Now, there have been several attempts to get underneath that gloss, that propaganda, and to look at the reality of what's happened in Iraq. And to do that, you have to go around, you have to go from house to house, you have to ask people, how many people in your family, how many people who live under this roof have died, how many of them have died violently, how many of them have died of other reasons that have been created by the occupation. And so the most serious attempt to do that was carried out by a US team and published in The Lancet, and there have been 2 efforts by that group. And the last estimate that they came up with over a year ago was that 655,000 Iraqis had died as a result of the invasion and occupation. That doesn't mean that 655,000 people were shot dead by Americans. It didn't just mean killed by the occupation forces. It didn't just mean people who had died violently, perhaps in a suicide bombing. It meant the number of people who had died who would not have died if there hadn't been an invasion and occupation. So they went to all those houses and they asked people, tell us about the people who've died, who lived under this roof. Not who you've heard about or your neighbours or something. People who lived under your roof. How many of them died in the period in the period 2 years before the war and the period after the war started? And they compared the death rate before the war and the death rate since the invasion. And the death rate had increased dramatically. So that doesn't just mean people who died violently. It doesn't just mean people who died in the greater number of car crashes that there are because people are racing to get home before the curfew sets in, because they're trying not to get stopped by robbers and so on. It means people who've also died because the healthcare system has declined, because the quality of water has declined. People who've died of diseases who would not have died if there hadn't been additional damage to the basic infrastructure of society. So it's all kinds of deaths go into that figure. Now, what the government likes to point to is the Iraq body count estimate of how many people have died in Iraq. And they try to make out there's a clash between those 2 figures, because the Iraq body count figure is much, much lower. But the Iraq body count figure is a figure for the people who have been reported in the media by 2 sources to have died in a violent incident. Someone who's been blown up or shot, that kind of incident. And so what they're measuring is 1 fraction of all the people who've died as a result of the war in Iraq. the people who've died in a violent situation, and of that, they're reporting only the people who've been reported in 2 separate media sources. So obviously, that is going to be a much smaller number. So there's no conflict between those two things. Now, another hat that I wear is that I'm also the co-editor of Peace News. And one of the things that has been one of the most shocking things that's happened since we started that job earlier this year was the way in which the latest estimate for the Iraq war dead has been treated. And we put it on our front page, which was 1.2 million Iraqi war dead, says poll. And in the rest of the media, it was mentioned on Newsnight for about 30 seconds. It was the second half of an article in the Observer, London Observer, and that was pretty much it in the national papers. What that poll was again, it's a British polling agency called ORB. They're a mainstream polling agency. They've done polls for the Financial Services Authority, for the BBC, for Countryside Commission and so on. They've done polls for lots of mainstream people. Previous polls of theirs have been quoted throughout the media because they've been government friendly. They've come out the way the government has liked. In this poll, they went to 15 of Iraq's 18 governorates. So they went all over the country and they asked 1,500 people, how many people in your family who live under your roof have died violently? So again, we're only talking about the violent deaths. And what they found out was that 16% of the households they went to said one family member had died violently since the invasion occupation. 5% said 2 family members had died, and 1% of those households said 3 people in their family had died violently since the occupation.